The ice holds secrets that time refuses to surrender, and in 1932, it claimed something from our village that we're still trying to understand. I've spent 70 years running from what I witnessed on that frozen shoreline, but the truth has a way of surfacing like bodies in thawed rivers. The wind still carries her laughter across the tundra, and every winter, when the bay freezes solid, I see her small footprints leading nowhere. What happened to little Sarah Kowalski wasn't natural, wasn't explainable, and it sure as hell wasn't the end of her story. Some mysteries are buried so deep in ice and time that they become legends, but this one refuses to stay buried, and tonight, I'm finally ready to tell you why. The photograph they found last month proved what I've known all along. Some children don't grow up because they're not supposed to. But what I'm about to share will make you question everything you thought you knew about life, death, and the cruel mathematics of time itself. I was 12 years old when Sarah disappeared, just 2 years younger than me, with blonde braids that caught the Arctic sun like spun gold. Our village of Ketchikan Bay was nothing more than a collection of weathered cabins hugging the shoreline, where 23 families scratched out an existence fishing the icy waters. The men left before dawn on their boats, their breath forming, clouds in the -20 air, while the women mended nets and kept the fires burning. Children like us were expected to stay close, help with chores, and never wander toward the ice shelf alone. But Sarah had always been different. She talked to the wind like it whispered back, collected smooth stones from the frozen beach, and claimed she could hear voices calling from beneath the ice. The adults dismissed it as childhood imagination, but I knew better because I heard them too. Something was living in that ice, something ancient and patient, and it had been watching Sarah for months before it finally took her. The morning she vanished started like any other brutal February day, with howling winds that cut through our wool coats like razors. Sarah's father, Henrik Kowalski, had left with the other fishermen to check the ice fishing holes 3 miles out on the bay. Her mother, Elena, was inside their cabin grinding wheat flour and humming old Polish lullabies that reminded her of the homeland she'd left behind. I remember watching Sarah through our frosted window as she played near the shore, building little snow figures and talking to herself in that sing-song voice she used. The thermometer outside our door read 38 below zero, but Sarah seemed immune to the cold, her cheeks barely pink while the rest of us huddled around wood stoves. She wore her red woolen coat, the one her mother had sewn with careful stitches in love, and her small boots left perfect impressions in the snow. But what I remember most clearly was how the ice seemed to shimmer around her, like it was alive and responding to her presence. By noon, when Elena called for lunch, Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her footprints led from their cabin door straight to the water's edge, where they simply stopped. Not disappeared, not covered by snow, not swept away by wind. They ended at the frozen shoreline as if she'd simply stepped into the air and vanished. Elena's screams brought the entire village running, and soon every able-bodied person was searching the ice, calling Sarah's name until our voices went hoarse. We searched the storage sheds, the boathouses, the root cellars where families kept their winter vegetables. We checked every hiding spot a child might choose, every warm corner where she might have fallen asleep. But the truth was becoming undeniable with each passing hour. Sarah hadn't hidden or wandered off. The ice had taken her, swallowed her, whole, and left nothing behind but those small footprints leading to nowhere. As darkness fell on that first night, Henrik returned from the fishing holes to find his world shattered. The big man who could haul 100-pound nets from frozen water broke down, sobbing when he saw his daughter's empty bed. Elena sat rocking in her chair, holding Sarah's favorite doll, and humming those Polish lullabies through tears that froze on her cheeks. The temperature dropped to 45 below, and we all knew that if Sarah was somewhere outside, somewhere lost in that white wilderness, she wouldn't survive the night. But I kept thinking about those footprints ending at the water's edge, about the way the ice had shimmered around her, about the voices she claimed to hear. Something told me, something cold and certain in my 12-year-old gut, that Sarah's disappearance wasn't about getting lost in a blizzard. The ice wanted her for reasons we couldn't understand, and it had been patient enough to wait for, the perfect moment to claim its prize. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the wind howl across the tundra, I made a promise I would later regret. I swore I'd find Sarah Kowalski, no matter how long it took, no matter where the search led me. I had no way of knowing that keeping that promise would take me 70 years, 3,000 miles, and into a truth so impossible that even now, telling you this story, I can barely believe it myself. The child who vanished into the ice in 1932 was waiting for me in ways I never could have imagined, and when I finally found her, or when she found me, I discovered that some promises bind us across decades, across the very fabric of time itself. But that's a story that starts with the morning after her disappearance, when we began the search that would consume our village and reveal secrets buried deeper than any grave. The search began at dawn with every soul in Ketchikan Bay forming, a line across the frozen wasteland, our voices echoing Sarah's name into the merciless white void. Henrik led the charge with desperate determination, his massive frame cutting through knee-deep snow while Elena followed behind, clutching Sarah's red mittens to her chest like a talisman. I stayed close to my father, watching the adults' faces grow more grim with each passing hour as we found nothing. No torn fabric caught on ice, no blood in the snow, no sign that a 7-year-old girl had ever walked this frozen earth. The temperature held steady at 30 below, and our breath formed ice crystals that fell like tiny diamonds to the ground. But what haunted me most wasn't the cold or the endless white. It was the silence that seemed to follow us, as if the Arctic itself was holding its breath. By midday, when we'd covered 5 square miles of tundra, I began to understand that we weren't just searching for a lost child. We were hunting something that defied every natural law I'd ever learned, and the ice was protecting its secret with a patience older than our village itself. The other children whispered about Sarah's strange behavior in the weeks before she disappeared, stories I'd dismissed as jealous gossip until now. Mary Petrov swore she'd seen Sarah walking on the frozen bay at midnight, her small figure glowing in the moonlight like a ghost. Tommy Henderson claimed Sarah had told him the ice was singing lullabies that only she could hear. Little Anna Kowalski, Sarah's own cousin, said Sarah had drawn pictures of herself standing inside what looked like a frozen cave, surrounded by other children who never moved or spoke. These tales seemed like childhood fantasy until we started finding Sarah's drawings hidden in the schoolhouse desk, dozens of sketches showing a girl with blonde braids standing among ice formations that looked almost like crystal coffins. Each drawing was dated, going back 3 months, and they all showed the same thing. Sarah surrounded by ice, but never afraid, never struggling. Instead, she looked peaceful, content, as if she belonged in that frozen world more than she ever belonged in ours. On the second day of searching, we discovered something that changed everything, a series of drawings carved directly into the ice near where Sarah's footprints ended. The markings weren't random scratches or childish doodles. They were deliberate symbols that formed a pattern none of us could understand. Some looked like ancient runes. Others resembled the traditional markings our Inuit neighbors carved into whalebone. But these were different, older, more complex, as if they contained knowledge from a time before human memory. Henrik knelt beside the frozen artwork, tracing the symbols with his thick fingers while tears froze in his beard. "She couldn't have done this," he whispered, his voice cracking like breaking ice. Sarah never learned to carve, never had tools strong enough to cut into ice this thick. But there they were, etched 6 inches deep into solid ice, telling a story we couldn't read. The wind picked up as we stared at those mysterious markings, and for just a moment, I could swear I heard children's voices carried on the Arctic air, including one that sounded exactly like Sarah. Elena's condition worsened as the days passed, her grief transforming into something that frightened even the adults in our close-knit community. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and spent entire nights standing at her kitchen window, staring at the frozen shore where her daughter had vanished. But it was her conversations with empty air that truly unsettled us. Long, detailed discussions with someone who wasn't there, answering questions no one had asked. "Yes, Sarah, I see you there," she'd whisper to the frost-covered glass. "Mama knows you're trying to come home. Mama's waiting for you, little star." When concerned neighbors tried to comfort her, Elena would insist that Sarah visited her every night, standing just beyond the window, pointing toward the ice with urgent gestures. The village doctor, old Dr. Peterson, diagnosed grief-induced hallucinations and prescribed rest. But I believed Elena was seeing something real. On the fourth night after Sarah's disappearance, I snuck out of my cabin and stood in the shadows near Elena's window. That's when I saw her too, a small figure in a red coat standing motionless on the frozen shore, visible only in the moonlight filtering through the aurora borealis dancing overhead. The figure looked exactly like Sarah, down to her blonde braids and the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. But something was wrong with the way she stood, too still, too perfect, like a photograph come to life. She didn't shiver despite the brutal cold, didn't shift her weight or fidget the way children do. Instead, she remained frozen in place for exactly 7 minutes before simply fading away, not walking off or disappearing behind snowdrifts, but becoming transparent until she was nothing but Arctic air. I ran back to my cabin with my heart hammering against my ribs, but I didn't tell anyone what I'd witnessed. Even at 12 years old, I understood that some truths are too dangerous to share, too impossible for adult minds to accept. But I also knew that Sarah wasn't dead, at least not in any way we understood death. She was somewhere between worlds, caught in the ice like an insect in amber, and she was trying desperately to communicate something to those of us she'd left behind. By the end of the first week, the official search was called off due to worsening weather conditions and the reality that no child could survive 7 days in temperatures that hadn't risen above 20 below zero. But Henrik refused to stop looking, spending every daylight hour wandering the ice, calling his daughter's name until his voice became nothing but a whisper. Elena continued her nightly vigils at the window, and I continued sneaking out to watch for the figure in the red coat. What I learned during those secret observations would haunt me for the rest of my life. Sarah appeared every night at exactly 11:47 p.m., stood in the same spot for precisely 7 minutes, and always pointed toward the same section of ice before vanishing. She was trying to tell us something, trying to guide us toward a truth buried beneath layers of frozen water and community secrets. But it would take 70 years, a team of historians with modern technology, and a photograph that should have been impossible before I finally understood what Sarah had been pointing at all along. The ice was more than ice. The child was more than lost. And our little village of Ketchikan Bay was built on a foundation of mysteries that ran deeper than any grave. The blizzard that struck Ketchikan Bay 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance was unlike anything our weathered community had ever endured, with winds reaching 80 miles per hour and temperatures plunging to 58 below zero. But Sarah Kowalski refused to abandon his search, even as the other men pleaded with him to wait out the storm in the safety of our heated cabins. I watched from our frosted window as he struggled through snowdrifts that reached his chest, his lantern creating a small circle of yellow light that seemed pathetic against the endless white fury. "That man's going to die out there," my father muttered, pulling on his heaviest coat despite my mother's protests. "And I'll be damned if I let grief make a widow of Elena before her time." What followed was the most terrifying night of my young life as 6 men from our village ventured into nature's wrath to save a man who'd already been claimed by something far more dangerous than any storm. But what they found in that howling wilderness would prove that Sarah's disappearance was connected to forces that had been sleeping beneath our feet for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal their terrible truth. My father, along with Sven Olsen, Marcus Reed, and 3 other village men, formed a rescue chain linked by rope and sheer determination as they followed Henrik's footprints deeper into the storm. I begged to go with them, but at 12 years old, I was deemed too young to risk my life in the blizzard that was already being called the worst in Alaska's recorded history. Instead, I pressed my face against the ice-covered glass and watched their lantern lights disappear into the white void, counting the minutes until they should return safely. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling our cabin walls and sending snow through every crack and crevice, while the women gathered at Elena's house to comfort her and wait for news. But Elena wasn't crying or praying like the other wives. She stood at her kitchen window with an expression of terrible certainty, as if she knew exactly what the men would find in that frozen wasteland. "They're going to see her," she whispered to the storm-darkened glass. "Sarah's been waiting for someone brave enough to follow her into the ice." Her words sent ice-cold fingers of fear down my spine because I'd seen that ghostly figure too, and I knew Sarah wasn't pointing toward empty tundra. 3 hours into their search, the rescue party found Henrik collapsed in a snowdrift 2 miles from the village, his body temperature dangerously low, but his eyes wide with terror and wonder. According to my father's later account, Henrik was muttering about children's voices calling from beneath the ice, about seeing Sarah standing in what looked like a frozen cathedral made entirely of crystal and snow. "She was there," Henrik kept repeating as they carried him back through the blizzard. "My little star was there with the other children, but they wouldn't let me reach her. The ice. It's alive, and it's been collecting them for longer than we've been here." The men initially dismissed his words as hypothermia-induced hallucinations, but when they tried to follow his footprints back to where he'd collapsed, they discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the frozen ground beneath our village. Henrik's trail led directly to a section of ice that shouldn't exist, a perfectly circular area where the snow had melted away despite temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. In the center of this impossible warm spot, they found children's toys buried in the ice, a wooden doll from the 1800s, a set of carved animals that looked decades old, and most disturbing of all, Sarah's red mitten frozen solid beneath 6 inches of clear ice. The discovery of those buried toys forced us to confront a truth our community had been avoiding for generations. Sarah wasn't the first child to disappear near our frozen shoreline. Old Timothy Morrison, the village's eldest resident at 82, finally broke his decades of silence and revealed the terrible pattern we'd all somehow missed. Every 20 to 30 years, dating back to the founding of Ketchikan Bay in 1847, a child between the ages of 6 and 8 would vanish near the water's edge during the coldest months of winter. The disappearances were always the same: footprints leading to the ice, no body ever found, and grieving families who eventually moved away rather than face another Arctic winter, haunted by their loss. We told ourselves they were accidents. Timothy confessed as the storm raged outside his cabin. Children falling through thin ice, getting lost in blizzards, attacked by bears or wolves. But deep down, we all knew something was taking them, something that lived in the ice and only emerged when the conditions were perfect. His revelation explained why certain areas of our shoreline remained strangely warm even in the deepest winter, why some families refused to let their children play alone near the water, and why our village had never grown beyond 23 families despite decades of opportunity and abundant fishing. The men who ventured into that blizzard returned, forever changed, carrying not just Henrik's half-frozen body but also the weight of impossible knowledge. They'd seen the warm circle in the ice, felt the unnatural heat rising from the frozen ground, and heard the children's voices that Henrik claimed were calling from somewhere far below the surface. Sven Olsen, normally the most practical man in our village, spent the next 3 days carving protective symbols around his cabin, claiming he'd learned the markings from his grandmother's stories about the old country. Marcus Reed, our village teacher, began researching every historical record he could find about unexplained disappearances in Arctic communities, searching for patterns that might explain what was happening to our children. But it was my father who made the most disturbing discovery of all. While helping Henrik recover from his ordeal, he noticed that the man's frostbitten fingers had somehow carved fresh symbols into the cabin walls, identical to the markings we'd found where Sarah's footprints ended. Henrik had no memory of making those carvings, no explanation for how his unconscious mind had reproduced ancient runes that shouldn't exist in modern Alaska. The ice wasn't just taking our children, it was communicating through the people who loved them most, leaving messages in a language older than human memory. As the storm finally began to subside on the 4th day, revealing a landscape transformed by countless tons of fresh snow, we discovered that the circular warm spot had grown larger overnight. What had been 6 feet in diameter was now nearly 12 feet across, and the children's toys that had been frozen beneath the surface were now clearly visible, as if the ice was deliberately revealing its collection. More disturbing still, new items had appeared, A child's shoe that looked exactly like ones Sarah had worn. A hair ribbon that matched the blue ones Elena braided into her daughter's blonde hair. And a small wooden cross carved with Polish prayers that Henrik swore he'd never seen before. The ice was telling us a story, showing us proof of what it had taken, but also offering us clues about where it kept its treasures. Standing at the edge of that impossible warm circle, feeling heat radiating from frozen ground that should have been solid to the bedrock, I finally understood what Sarah had been pointing at during her nightly appearances. She wasn't trying to show us where she'd gone. She was showing us where we needed to look, where the answers to our village's darkest secret lay waiting beneath layers of ice and decades of deliberately forgotten truth. The warm circle in the ice became our village's most guarded secret and our greatest obsession, growing larger each night until it stretched 20 feet across, revealing treasures that spanned nearly a century of lost children. We took shifts watching over it, partly from curiosity and partly from a growing fear that something might emerge from the depths if left unguarded. Old Timothy Morrison brought his grandfather's mining tools, convinced that whatever lay beneath, the ice was close enough to reach with conventional digging. But every attempt to break through the surface met with the same impossible resistance. The ice appeared thin and fragile, yet our strongest men couldn't chip more than a few inches before their tools began to smoke and burn from contact with something that defied every law of physics. The heat continued rising from the depths, creating a pocket of spring-like warmth in the heart of an Arctic winter. And with that heat came sounds that made grown men weep with recognition. Children's laughter echoed from somewhere far below, accompanied by voices calling for parents who had been mourning their loss for decades. Among those voices, clear as church bells on Christmas morning, we could all hear Sarah Kowalski singing the Polish lullabies her mother had taught her. Elena's condition stabilized once the voices became audible to everyone, as if having witnesses. To her daughter's presence had somehow validated her sanity and grief. She spent entire days sitting beside the warm circle, conducting conversations with Sarah that the rest of us could only hear one side of, but which made perfect sense given the child's responses that drifted up through layers of impossible ice. "Yes, Mama understands you're not alone down there," Elena would whisper to the glowing surface. "Tell Mama about the other children. Are they taking care of you? Are you warm enough?" The answers came in Sarah's unmistakable 7-year-old voice, describing a place that sounded less like a tomb and more like an underground paradise where children played eternal games in chambers made of living crystal. But there was something in Sarah's tone that troubled me deeply, a quality of ancient wisdom that no 7-year-old should possess, as if the ice was teaching her things about the world that were meant to remain hidden. When Elena asked if Sarah wanted to come home, the long silence that followed was more heartbreaking than any words could have been. Henrik threw himself into research with the desperate energy of a man trying to solve an equation that might return his daughter to the world of the living. He wrote letters to universities across the continent, contacted geologists and archaeologists, even reached out to tribal elders from Inuit communities hundreds of miles north of our village. What he discovered painted a picture of our supposedly remote settlement that none of us had ever suspected. Ketchikan Bay wasn't randomly chosen by the founders in 1847, but had been deliberately built over a site that indigenous peoples had considered sacred for thousands of years. The native stories spoke of ice spirits who collected the souls of children during the coldest winters, preserving them in a place between worlds where they could remain forever young and forever happy. These weren't tales of death and tragedy, but of transformation and protection, of children who were chosen for a purpose greater than any mortal life could offer. The spirits took only those who were pure of heart and strong of spirit, keeping them safe in crystal chambers while the world above aged and changed and forgot the old ways. The most disturbing revelation came when Henrik translated the symbols that had appeared carved into the ice around our warm circle, markings that matched ancient petroglyphs found throughout the Arctic, all telling variations of the same story. The ice spirits weren't malevolent entities stealing children for cruel purposes. They were guardians protecting something precious from a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to magic and wonder. The children they selected became bridge builders between the world above and the world below, messengers who could communicate with the living while dwelling safely in the realm of eternal winter. But the translations also revealed a darker truth. The ice spirits collection wasn't random or unlimited. They could only take children during specific celestial alignments that occurred roughly every 25 years, and they could only sustain their underground paradise by drawing energy from the love and grief of the families left behind. Our mourning wasn't just natural human sorrow. It was fuel for a supernatural engine that kept our children alive in their crystal prison. As spring approached and the circle began to stabilize at 30 feet across, we started experiencing phenomena that challenged our understanding of reality itself. Photographs taken near the warm ice showed additional figures that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. Dozens of children standing in formation around Sarah, all wearing clothes from different decades, all frozen at the moment of their disappearance. Some appeared to be holding hands in an endless circle. Others pointed upward toward the world they'd left behind, and a few seemed to be writing messages in the ice that became visible only through the camera lens. These phantom images convinced our village photographer, James Mitchell, to begin documenting everything he could about the warm circle and its supernatural properties. He spent weeks taking pictures from every angle, at every time of day, using different cameras and film, stocks to capture what he called temporal echoes, glimpses of past events that had somehow been preserved in the ice like insects in amber. It was James who first noticed that some of the children in the photographs appeared to be aging slightly between shots, not growing older in the traditional sense, but becoming more translucent, more ethereal, as if they were slowly transitioning from one state of existence to another. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Sarah herself began appearing in James's photographs during daylight hours, no longer confined to Elena's midnight vigils at the kitchen window. These daytime images showed her standing at the edge of the warm circle, pointing not down into the ice but up toward the sky, her mouth open as if she was trying to shout a warning that couldn't penetrate the barrier between worlds. Her expression had changed from the peaceful contentment we'd heard in her voice during conversations with Elena. Now she looked urgent, almost frightened, as if something in the underground paradise had shifted and she needed to communicate, desperately, with the world above. The other children in the photographs showed similar changes, their faces turned upward with expressions of growing alarm, their hands reaching toward the surface as if they were trying to climb back into our world. James's final photograph, taken just days before the ice began to thaw with unusual speed, showed all the children pressed against what looked like a transparent barrier just inches beneath the surface, their mouths moving in perfect unison as they tried to scream a warning that we were too late to understand. The ice spirits were losing control of their collection, and something ancient and terrible was preparing to emerge from depths that had remained undisturbed since the world was young. 70 years had passed since Sarah Kowalski vanished into the ice, and I had become the last living witness to those terrible events in Ketchikan Bay, carrying the weight of impossible memories through 7 decades of restless nights. The village was long gone, abandoned after 3 more children disappeared during the harsh winter of 1958, when the families finally accepted that our remote settlement was cursed beyond redemption. I had built a new life in Seattle, married, a good woman who never questioned why I avoided winter vacations or refused to let our children play on frozen ponds. But the past has a way of hunting down those who try to escape it, and in 2002, a package arrived at my door that would drag me back into the nightmare I thought I'd left buried under tons of Arctic snow. Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Washington's History Department had somehow acquired James Mitchell's entire collection of photographs from Ketchikan Bay, including dozens of images I'd never seen, shots he'd taken in secret during those final weeks before the village evacuation. Her letter explained that she was researching abandoned settlements in Alaska for her doctoral thesis, but what she'd discovered in those old photographs defied everything she thought she knew about historical documentation and the nature of time itself. The photographs Dr. Chen showed me in her cluttered university office were impossible artifacts that challenged the very foundations of reality. James Mitchell's camera had captured not just the warm circle and the ghostly children, but temporal layers that revealed the true scope of what had been happening beneath our village for over a century. Images taken in 1932 somehow contained figures from the 1890s, the 1910s, and even what appeared to be children from decades that hadn't yet occurred when the shutter clicked. "Look at this one," Dr. Chen said. spreading an enlarged print across her desk with trembling hands. This photograph was definitely taken in 1932. We can verify that from the camera model, the film stock, even the clothing worn by the adults in the background. But see, this child here, standing with Sarah Kowalski. She pointed to a figure I remembered well, a boy of perhaps 8 years old wearing clothes that had seemed outdated even in our remote village. I found his missing person report in the Juneau archives. Tommy Anderson disappeared in 1847 during the village's first winter. He should have been dead for 85 years when this picture was taken, but he looks exactly the same as he did in the daguerreotype his parents commissioned before he vanished. The more photographs Dr. Chen revealed, the more I understood that James Mitchell had unknowingly documented something that transcended normal human experience. His camera had become a window into a place where time flowed differently, where children from across nearly 2 centuries existed simultaneously in a crystalline realm that touched our world only during specific conditions. Sarah wasn't just trapped in ice. She was living in a temporal bubble where past, present, and future children could interact across decades of separation. But here's what's truly disturbing, Dr. Chen continued, pulling out a magnifying glass and pointing to a section of one photograph I'd never examined closely. When I digitally enhanced these images and increased the resolution, I found something that shouldn't be possible. Look at the reflection in this ice formation behind the children. Under magnification, the surface of the ice showed not the Arctic landscape of 1932, but what appeared to be modern buildings, cars that wouldn't be, invented for decades, and people wearing clothing from the late 20th century. The ice spirits hadn't just been collecting children across time. They'd been observing the future, watching our world evolve while their young prisoners remained forever unchanged in their crystal paradise. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen used modern digital analysis software to examine layers of the photographs that James Mitchell's 1930s equipment couldn't have detected. Hidden beneath the visible images were what she called temporal watermarks, faint impressions of the same locations photographed across multiple decades, all somehow compressed into single frames of film. Sarah appeared in dozens of these hidden layers, aging slightly in some images, remaining perfectly preserved in others, but always present, always watching, always trying to communicate something vital to the world above. She's not just pointing upward in these pictures, Dr. Chen explained as she scrolled through digital enhancements on her computer. She's pointing to specific dates, specific times when the barrier between worlds becomes thin enough for communication. Look at her finger positions. They're forming numbers. When we decoded Sarah's gestures across multiple photographs, they spelled out a date that made my blood turn to ice. March 15, 2003, just 4 months from when Dr. Chen first contacted me. The child who had been lost for 70 years was trying to tell us when she would finally be able to return. But the photographs revealed something even more terrifying than Sarah's prophetic messages. They showed what had been growing in the depths beneath Ketchikan Bay during all those decades of abandonment. Without the village above to provide the emotional energy that sustained their crystal paradise, the ice spirits had begun to change, to hunger for something more substantial than grief and longing. The children in the later photographs looked different. Their faces gaunt with an ancient weariness that suggested their eternal youth came at a price none of us had understood. Sarah's expression in the most recent images showed not the peaceful contentment of a child playing in a magical wonderland, but the desperate urgency of someone who had learned terrible truths about her captors and needed to warn the world before it was too late. The ice spirits weren't benevolent guardians protecting children from the harsh realities of mortal life. They were parasites feeding on the life force of their prisoners, keeping them alive just long enough to extract every drop of youth and innocence before moving on to fresh victims. And according to the patterns Dr. Chen had identified in the photographs, they were preparing to emerge from their underground realm to hunt in the modern world. The final photograph in James Mitchell's collection, one he had apparently taken just hours before fleeing Ketchikan Bay forever, showed all the collected children pressed against the ice barrier in expressions of absolute terror. But Sarah stood apart from the others, her small hands flat against the transparent surface, her mouth open in what was clearly a scream of warning. Behind her, just visible in the crystalline depths, stood figures that were definitely not children. tall, angular beings made of living ice, with eyes that burned like frozen stars and mouths that seemed to contain infinite darkness. These were the ice spirits in their true form, and they were no longer content to wait for children to wander close to their domain. The barrier that had kept them contained beneath the Arctic ice was weakening, and they were preparing to walk among humans for the first time in centuries. Sarah had spent 70 years trying to warn us about this moment, leaving clues in photographs and messages carved in ice. But we had been too focused on our grief to understand that she wasn't just asking for rescue. She was trying to save the world from the creatures who had taken her. The date she had indicated with her pointed fingers was approaching rapidly, and I finally understood why I was the only survivor of Ketchikan Bay still alive to receive Dr. Chen's research. March 15, 2003, arrived with an unseasonable warmth, that melted snow across the Pacific Northwest, and I knew in my bones that Sarah's 70-year vigil was finally coming to an end. Dr. Chen and I had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering equipment that might help us communicate with or possibly rescue the children trapped beneath what had once been Ketchikan Bay. The site was now completely abandoned, marked only by foundation stones and the perpetual warm circle that satellite imagery confirmed had grown to nearly 100 feet in diameter. But as we approached the location in Dr. Chen's research helicopter, what we found defied every expectation and filled me with a terror I hadn't felt since childhood. The ice had cracked open like an enormous flower, revealing a crystalline chamber that descended deep into the earth, and standing at its edge, exactly as she had appeared in those final photographs, was Sarah Kowalski, still 7 years old, still wearing her red woolen coat, still radiating the impossible innocence of a child who had never experienced the passage of time. But her eyes held the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades, and when she looked up at our approaching aircraft, I saw in her gaze both the little girl I had known and the ancient guardian she had somehow become. The moment our eyes met across that impossible gulf of years, I felt the weight of my 12-year-old promise finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a new understanding of what it truly meant to keep faith with the lost. Sarah didn't speak when we landed and approached the opened ice chamber, but she didn't need to. Her presence communicated volumes about what had transpired in the crystal depths during those long years of separation from the mortal world. The other children were arranged in a perfect circle around the chamber's edge, dozens of them spanning nearly 2 centuries of disappearances, all preserved at the moment of their taking but somehow transformed by their experience in the realm between worlds. They watched us with expressions of profound sadness mixed with an otherworldly serenity, as if they had long ago accepted their fate but had never stopped mourning the families they left behind. Tommy Anderson, the boy who had vanished in 1847, stood closest to Sarah, his small hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of protection that suggested she had become their leader, their spokesperson, their bridge between the ice spirits and the human world they had lost. The air around them shimmered with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. This was the chill of eternity, of time suspended, of childhood frozen at its most perfect and most tragic moment. Dr. Chen stood beside me, her scientific equipment forgotten, as she stared at living proof that history was far stranger and more magical than any university had ever taught her. As I stepped closer to the edge of the crystalline chamber, I could see the intricate beauty of the prison that had held these children for so many decades. Walls of living ice that pulsed with their own inner light, formations that looked like frozen waterfalls and crystal trees, passages that led deeper into the earth than human engineering had ever reached. The temperature around the chamber was perfectly controlled, warm enough to prevent frostbite, but cold enough to preserve the supernatural state that kept the children suspended between life and death. Flowers made of ice bloomed along the chamber. Walls, their petals so delicate they seemed to move with each breath of air. And I realized that this wasn't just a prison, but a work of art created by beings who understood beauty in ways human minds could barely comprehend. The ice spirits had built a paradise for their captives, a place where childhood could exist in its purest form without the contamination of adult concerns, but they had never understood that true childhood requires the possibility of growth, the promise of tomorrow, the hope of becoming something more than what you are today. The beauty of their creation was also its tragedy, and I could see in the children's faces that they had long ago recognized this fundamental flaw in their guardian's logic. The guardians are dying, Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the musical quality I remembered, but layered with harmonics that seemed to come from the crystalline walls themselves. They've sustained us for so long that they've forgotten their own purpose, and now they're fading back into the ice from which they came. She gestured toward the depths of the chamber, where we could see the tall, angular figures that had appeared in James Mitchell's final photograph. But they were translucent now, barely visible against the crystal formations that had been their home for millennia. They took us to preserve something precious, the pure joy and wonder of childhood before the world could taint it with adult sorrows. But they've learned what we knew all along. Love cannot be preserved by stealing it from its source. The other children nodded in unison, their faces reflecting a shared understanding of truths that adults spend lifetimes failing to comprehend. They had been prisoners, yes, but they had also been teachers, showing their captors that true innocence cannot be maintained through isolation from the world that creates it. The ice spirits, in their alien wisdom, had finally understood that they were not preserving childhood, but destroying it, and their acceptance of this truth was killing them more surely than any weapon could. Dr. Chen found her voice first, her scientific training helping her process what defied all rational explanation. "How long have you been conscious down there?" she asked, her recorder forgotten in her trembling hands. "Have you been aware of the passing years?" Sarah's smile was heartbreaking in its mixture of childish sweetness and ancient sadness. "Time moves differently in the crystal realm," she explained. "Sometimes a day felt like a year. Sometimes a decade passed like a dream. We could see the world above through the ice, watch the seasons change, watch our families grow old and die, and be replaced by new families who never knew we existed." She paused, looking directly at me with recognition that bridged 7 decades. "We saw you too. The boy who promised to find me. We watched you grow up, get married, have children of your own, carry the weight of secrets you couldn't share with anyone who would believe you." Her words hit me like physical blows because she was right. I had spent my entire adult life haunted by what I'd witnessed in Ketchikan Bay, unable to fully engage with the present because part of me was always that 12-year-old boy standing in the snow watching footprints lead to nowhere. The children hadn't just been trapped in their crystal prison, they had been forced to witness the lives they could never live, the futures they would never experience. As the ice spirits continued their gradual dissolution into mist and memory, Sarah explained the choice that lay before the collected children. They could return to the world above and experience the natural aging they had been denied, or they could choose to fade with their guardians, becoming part of the eternal ice that had sheltered them for so long. "Some of us want to go home," she said, looking directly at me with eyes that held echoes of the little girl who used to build snow figures on the frozen shore. "We want to feel our parents' arms, even if they're different parents now, even if we have to grow old and die like everyone else. But others have been here so long that the world above feels like a dream they once had, but can no longer remember." The division among the children was heartbreaking to witness. Some stepped forward eagerly, their faces bright with hope of reunion and normal life, while others shrank back toward the crystal walls, terrified of leaving the only home they could clearly remember. A girl who looked no older than 6, wearing a dress from the 1920s, began to cry as she tried to choose between the safety of eternal childhood and the uncertainty of a world that had moved beyond anything she could understand. The ice spirits, even in their dying state, watched these proceedings with what might have been compassion, finally understanding the cruelty they had inflicted in their misguided attempt to preserve innocence. Tommy Anderson stepped forward, his 19th-century clothing pristine despite decades in the ice chamber, his Swedish accent still carrying the cadences of his immigrant parents. "I choose to stay," he said in a voice that carried the weight of careful consideration across impossible years. "My family is dust now. My world is gone. The language I spoke is barely remembered even in the old country. But here I can remain, as I was in my mother's heart, her little boy forever, the son who never disappointed her, never broke her promises, never grew old enough to understand how hard life became after I vanished. Several other children nodded their agreement, accepting their eternal preservation over an uncertain return to a world that had moved on without them. I understood their choice even as it broke my heart. They had become living memorials to the love their families had felt, preserved at the moment of their greatest innocence and their family's deepest devotion. In choosing to remain in the ice, they were choosing to honor that love rather than risk contaminating it with the complexities of adult existence. These children had learned something about sacrifice that most adults never comprehend, and their decision to fade into legend rather than risk disappointment showed a wisdom that came not from age but from having witnessed the full spectrum of human experience from their crystal sanctuary. But Sarah had made a different choice, one that would require a sacrifice none of us fully understood, until she began to glow with an inner light that seemed to draw energy from the very foundations of the ice chamber. "I'm going to break the cycle," she announced, her small figure somehow commanding despite her 7-year-old appearance. "The guardians will die anyway, but their power can be redirected, not to preserve childhood but to heal the wounds their preservation caused." She looked at me with eyes that held love and forgiveness for the boy who had promised to find her and had taken 70 years to keep that vow. The families who lost children to the ice, they deserve peace, not eternal grieving. I can give them that peace, but it means I can never truly go home. The light around Sarah intensified, and I realized she was somehow channeling the dying ice spirit's power, preparing to use their ancient magic for an act of unprecedented compassion. She would sacrifice her chance at a normal life to heal decades of unresolved loss, to give closure to families who had spent lifetimes wondering what became of their vanished children. The other children watched in awe as she transformed before our eyes, becoming something that bridged the gap between human and spirit, between the world of the living and the realm of eternal memory. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. Instead, Sarah began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement, her physical form becoming translucent while somehow becoming more present than before. Dr. Chen's equipment began registering energy readings that defied conventional physics, electromagnetic patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with human heartbeats, temperature fluctuations that corresponded to emotional states rather than atmospheric conditions. "She's becoming a living bridge," Dr. Chen whispered in amazement, her scientific skepticism crumbling before the evidence of her own instruments. "She's transforming into something that can exist simultaneously in our world and theirs, carrying messages between the living and the lost." Sarah's voice, when she spoke again, seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the crystalline walls, from the warming air, from some place deep in our own hearts where childhood memories lived forever. "I can reach them," she said, and I knew she was speaking about the families who had never stopped grieving, the parents who had spent decades wondering if their lost children were safe, warm, loved. "I can visit their dreams, show them that we were protected, that we were happy in our strange way, that they can finally let go of their guilt and fear." The gift she was offering wasn't resurrection or reunion. It was the peace that comes from knowing that love transcends physical presence, that some bonds are strong enough to survive even the most impossible separations. The final transformation began as Sarah walked to the center of the crystal chamber, her red coat brilliant against the translucent walls that had contained her for 7 decades, but now she seemed to be wearing light itself rather than woolen fabric. One by one, the children who chose to return began aging rapidly but gently, their preserved youth flowing into Sarah's glowing form as she absorbed not just their sacrificed years, but all the love, grief, and hope that had sustained the ice spirit's realm. I watched faces that had remained 7, 8, or 9 years old for decades suddenly mature into young adults, then middle-aged people, then elderly individuals who carried the accumulated wisdom of their impossible experience. They stepped forward into the modern world with tears of joy and sorrow mixing on faces that finally showed their true age, their bodies catching up to the years their souls had lived while trapped in crystal. Some collapsed from the shock of sudden aging, but they were smiling as Dr. Chen and I helped them, finally able to feel their hearts beating with the natural rhythm of mortal time. These returned children would need years of adjustment, decades of therapy, entire lifetimes to process what they had experienced, but they would have those lifetimes now. The one gift the ice spirits had never been able to offer. And through it all, Sarah stood at the center of the chamber, growing brighter and more ethereal as she absorbed the magical energy that had sustained their impossible preservation. Those who chose to remain underwent a different transformation, slowly merging with the ice itself in a process that was beautiful rather than frightening, becoming decorative formations that would preserve their essence without requiring the life force of future children to sustain them. They became living art, conscious crystalline sculptures that could still think and dream, but no longer needed to hunger for the warmth of human love to survive. Tommy Anderson was the last to choose this path, his small hand touching mine one final time, before he stepped backward into an alcove that seemed designed specifically for him. "Tell them our stories," he whispered as crystal began to form around his feet, climbing slowly upward like clear water freezing in reverse. "Tell them we chose this not from fear but from love. Love for the families who mourned us. Love for the children who might have been taken in our place. Love for the world that deserved better than our selfish desire to remain forever young." He smiled as the crystal reached his chest, his eyes still bright and aware even as his body became part of the chamber's eternal architecture. "We're not dying," he said as the transformation completed. "We're becoming something new, something that can guard against the kind of hunger that created us." The crystallized children retained their consciousness, but lost their need to consume the grief of others, becoming benevolent guardians who would ensure that no ice spirits could ever again mistake preservation for protection, imprisonment for love. And Sarah, my brave little Sarah, with her blonde braids now flowing like golden light around her transformed figure, became a guardian of a different sort. Not a captor of childhood innocence, but a protector of family love, ensuring that no parent would ever again suffer the endless uncertainty that had consumed Elena and Henrik Kowalski. I could feel her presence expanding beyond the chamber, reaching across continents and decades to touch the hearts of everyone who had ever lost a child to unexplained circumstances. She carried with her the memories and personalities of every child who had been taken by the ice spirits, becoming their voice, their messenger, their final gift to the world they had left behind. Through dreams and moments of unexpected peace, she would visit the bereaved, showing them glimpses of crystal chambers where their lost ones had played and laughed and remained safe, if not free. The returned children would serve as living proof that survival was possible, that love could transcend even the most impossible circumstances, that families could be reunited across any gulf of time or space if the heart's determination was strong enough. As the chamber began to seal itself, the ice reforming but without the hungry magic that had once powered it, I realized that Sarah's transformation was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new kind of guardian spirit, one dedicated to healing rather than preserving, to peace rather than possession. As the chamber sealed itself forever, leaving only a warm spot in the earth where so much joy and sorrow had been contained, I finally understood that some promises transcend the boundaries of time and death. Sarah had kept her own promise, to find a way home to her mother's heart, not by returning to a world that had moved beyond her, but by transforming into something that could heal the wounds her disappearance had created. The photograph that started Dr. Chen's investigation, the image of a child who never aged, became not evidence of supernatural imprisonment, but proof of love's power to transcend every limitation mortality can impose. The returned children walked with us toward the helicopter, their aged faces showing wonder at the modern world they would now be free to explore, while the crystallized children remained as beautiful guardians in their eternal chamber, and Sarah's transformed spirit spread across the world like warm light touching every heart that had ever known the specific grief of a missing child. As we flew away from the site that had shaped my entire life, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since I was 12 years old, watching a little girl in a red coat play in the snow without knowing she would soon become a bridge between worlds. Though I am now the last keeper of Ketchikan Bay's secrets, I know that Sarah's story doesn't end with my telling of it. It continues in every parent who finds unexpected peace after loss, every family who discovers that love persists beyond physical presence, and every child who looks at winter ice and hears not the call of hungry spirits, but the echo of laughter that time cannot silence.